So Marie,
Yeah.
I realised that this summer is 8 years since I qualified as a teacher.
Wow.
And I just cannot get over how education has changed in that time. Like 8 years doesn't seem like that long, but obviously with COVID and everything,
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of changes, hasn't there? I think the educational environment looks completely different now than it did. You know,
Absolutely.
budgets are squeezed, people,
Yeah.
there's a lot more absenteeism for
Yeah. Are
various
you finding
reasons.
COVID catch-up is still happening? Or
Yeah, definitely. It is still happening and sometimes not happening,
Well,
which
yeah.
is more worrying.
I mean, I think COVID catch-up will be happening for the next
I think it'll be happening for a
18
while.
years,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the kids who were born in, my nephew is at nursery, or rather wasn't at nursery because of COVID, and that will have had an impact. And we'll be talking about COVID catch-up in 20 years still,
Yeah,
while they're
I
at
think you're right.
university.
Yeah. And you say you qualified 8 years ago. I qualified 20 years ago.
I'm not going to point out that
How
that's about when I
ancient
started
am
secondary
I?
school.
I know. Don't, please don't. Please don't.
It's your own time you're wasting. Ramblings from Beyond the Classroom with Marie and Jodie.
We are joined today by Rebecca Stott, our lovely guest. She's the Director of Education here at Twinkl. Welcome, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you, Jodie. Marie, I'm really, really glad to be here today. Been a massive fan of your podcast for ages.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, what's your opinion on how education has changed in the last 10 years or so?
It was really interesting sort of listening to yourself and Marie discussing that at the beginning. I think my own journey now, I've been in education now for sort of 16 years after a switch from journalism. And I think in that time, particularly in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of changes to the landscape. And I think one thing that was jumping into your conversation there was thinking back to my time as sort of secondary head of department. In 2019, we were seeing the last of the changes to the curriculum subjects, and we were seeing the new officers come in. We didn't have very long to embed that in secondary before we went into lockdown. So I'm wondering if part of the COVID catch-up is not necessarily directly related to COVID catch-up, whether it is merely the symptom of a really knowledge-rich curriculum that schools are still embedding now in that post-COVID landscape. So it's potentially a little bit both working together. But I think what's particularly interesting at the moment is the way COVID accelerated the use of digital technology.
It was one of the good things that came out of COVID was the use of ed tech and maybe understanding that education can look different for different people. That's one of the things that I think came out of it.
I think I agree with you. I think something you just started to say there was perhaps we've gone backwards again afterwards. We finally got to a point we'd stepped away from a Victorian classroom. But I think what we saw in some schools towards the end of that was technology fatigue. And I think a lot of people have stepped away from technology again, where arguably, we potentially have gone a little bit backwards when we've made quite a few big jumps forward. But it's interesting to see how it has impacted. And I think as well, what's been particularly interesting in the last 18 months is AI. And there is something that's bringing a lot of potential for education that the DfE have kind of rightly pulled out as a way of reducing workload. However, I think at the moment, kind of judging by stats coming out of European surveys and UK surveys, the majority of schools at the moment don't quite know what to do with that technology and are slightly apprehensive to fully embrace it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is a fear attached to AI. In terms of you want original thoughts and work from your pupils. You don't want them to have the opportunity to just put in a question to a computer and get a full essay back.
See, I think, and we've talked about this before, I do think it's an interesting difference between English and maths, is that you do want students to obviously have creative thoughts in maths, but at the end of the day, there's only one right answer, whereas English, AI is kind of seen as more of a threat, whereas in maths, AI's been around for ages, we just call it a calculator.
Yeah, you're right. It's the first time AI's been able to interact with humans on that sort of creative forum, and that is feared absolutely in schools because it's not what we want to lose from our pupils.
Jodie, I was just going to say what was quite interesting is myself Twinkl CEO and David were down at Cambridge University's DEFI conference quite recently, and we were exploring the idea of AI at that conference. And one of the keynote speakers was the Right Honourable Charles Clarke. And he said something that I hadn't actually realised, and that was that when he was a junior minister back in 1975, they were talking then about how technology was going to revolutionise education. But yet we're sitting here now 24 and we've not really seen that revolution for kind of the reasons we touched on earlier. And I think what was quite interesting about the point that Sir Charles Clarke made was it has to be a really, really, really systematic approach between government putting the legislation, the support in place, educators, pupils and parents to really utilise that technology and actually drive that change forward. But I think it was really quite eye-opening that it was happening in 1975, because when I started writing my MA in how digital tech can support SEND learners in sort of around 2010, I thought that was quite groundbreaking. It wasn't, because it had been going on a long, long, long time in the background. As you rightly say, it's those different steps of technology introduced into education, different points from the calculator right through to AI.
I don't know if you agree with me, Rebecca and Jodie, but I feel like the technology has accelerated outside the classroom to the point that it's an everyday thing for the pupils that you're teaching, and then you get to school and suddenly it all disappears and it's all exercise books and pens.
And I think that really jumped out at me when I started my teacher training back in 2008 in London. I'd come from journalism, which was like really up on digital technology. Going back in to train to be a secondary English teacher, like you say, Marie, suddenly it was back to the Victorian era. Some people were still using chalk and a blackboard. Kids had exercise books, and apart from the staff computer, you weren't seeing an awful lot of tech in the majority of schools, apart from some pioneering schools that might have been doing something a little bit different. And I think straight away that piqued my interest, that led me to Twinkl, because I'm coming from a world of digital technology. You know, the young people have got these skills. I think the Australian theorist Victorian Carradine wrote about this. They've got this whole bank of digital skills that they're being asked to leave at the door. And that's not necessarily preparing them for modern life. And I think that was something that was very sort of like eye-opening moment, stepping into school and seeing that was the case. And then that later inspired my journey to Twinkl, probably, because at every stage of my career, I've been looking at ways you can utilise digital technology in the classroom, at subject leadership level, at whole school level, at trust level, to reduce workload for staff, whilst really improving outcomes for all learners, in particular SEND students, where digital technology can really bridge the gap, I think.
So that kind of leads us on to our next question. You've recently joined us here at Twinkl. Why did you take the role, and what are your big plans?
I think it was a really exciting opportunity. I think it was last January I saw the job interview, the job advertised at Twinkl. And sort of prior to that, I'd started secondary English, then gone to head of media, then gone into senior leadership and trust leadership. And all steps kind of working at school, county and regional level. Yeah, so I think the opportunity at Twinkl was incredibly exciting, because I saw straight away it was going to allow continue this journey that I'd sort of started at classroom level, subject level, whole school level, county regional level, in a way that would let me help educators nationally and internationally to reduce their workload through the use of digital technology and high quality curriculum resources, while improving outcomes for all learners. And I think that was incredibly exciting as an opportunity, and I was really, really thrilled to get the job here with you all at Twinkl.
What's on your mind? Let us know your thoughts, ideas and anecdotes. Drop us a line at beyondmailbag@twinkl.co.uk.
Out of interest, Rebecca, what is it you would like to see in schools with regard to technology?
I think I've already seen it. It's a little bit of a utopia, but I was really, really lucky to be working for a trust a couple of years ago that were very, very ahead of the curve with digital technology. And just before lockdown, they'd actually adopted across the entire trust a digital curriculum. So all students were issued with an iPad, and it was part of my job to develop the curriculum so that all lessons and everything was actually online. And for me, the accelerated learning that we saw from that particular environment was absolutely phenomenal. And I'm not saying we should take away traditional reading, writing on pens with have you in the classroom, but actually having that duality of digital technology in conjunction with traditional teaching methods, really meant that every learner was really thriving in that environment. And I hoped post-COVID it was something we would see being adopted in all schools. And I understand the limitations of internet bandwidth and various things, but I think for me, that was absolutely phenomenal to see that across all subject areas in the school, and the learning was phenomenal. And when we did staff surveys, the response was coming back, it was reducing workload and improving well-being, because the digital marking was reducing physical
Yeah.
marking workload, and there was so many advantages to that. And I think with Twinkl we could help deliver that for all schools, because as you know from the wonderful work you do, we're developing schemes of work and resources have you that can be adopted in classrooms. And I think we take it for granted because we're making it every day.
Yeah.
And I think it's just something I'd like to see widely adopted.
So one of the areas you're focusing on, Rebecca, is thought leadership. Can you give us the quick guide as to what that is, please?
Yeah, sure. So thought leadership's a relatively new term inside education, but it's actually something that's actually very, very simple to understand when you break it down. And I think you guys are already thought leaders yourselves, because basically the term thought leadership simply means being an expert in a subject. So it means being very, very knowledgeable on a particular area and using that knowledge of the landscape to actually make decisions. So if you're a senior leader or a school leader, you're horizon scanning anyway. And thought leadership is that ability to use that information to drive education change as opposed to simply reacting to it. And I think the other thing about thought leadership that's particularly exciting and particularly important, it's also about forming relevant partnerships. So it's about sharing your expertise with others and reaching out and building community, either locally, nationally or internationally, to really improve the quality of education for all concerned.
Interesting. So as a bog standard day-to-day teacher educator, how is thought leadership relevant?
It's completely relevant for absolutely every educator, because if you're a thought leader in your particular, say you're teaching English, for example, and you've got a particular group and you've got a group of students in that room that are underachieving for a certain moment, if you're approaching that from a thought leadership approach, you would start researching that particular area that was a barrier and finding new approaches or liaising with the community to find different ways of engaging those students to improve outcomes for all. And then you can just do that at every level inside your education journey, really.
So would you say this is something that has been happening anyway? It's just that we've sort of formalised it and given it a name?
Yeah, I think absolutely, definitely. I think the majority of good and outstanding teachers and leaders would have naturally been doing thought leadership. It would have come under different names. And I think another reason it's been given a proper title at this point is the logical shift that we've done towards the education community being more evidence driven. So obviously we know as educators it's very important to draw on research and to draw on academic evidence. And I think through bringing in the name thought leadership, it kind of like firms up that process.
So education, as we were chatting about at the beginning, been through some huge changes here, both recently and kind of going back through history. What do you think is the main challenges for today's teachers, and how can thought leadership help address them?
I think if you look at the international data at the moment, the key things that we're looking at internationally in every country is recruitment and retention. I think that's the biggest challenge for so many different reasons. And I think the solution to that comes back partly to what we were talking about earlier. And it is really the embracing of AI and digital technology to reduce workload. And I think the role thought leadership plays there as well. It's not just about reducing workload to improve recruitment and retention, it's about improving well-being. And you can improve well-being by reducing workload, but it's also about building communities.
Yeah.
And I think this is where thought leadership comes in, because you can be a thought leader on your own, but you're certainly going to achieve a lot more rapidly through liaising and sharing skills. And I think we've seen that with the shift towards a trust landscape. So once you start working in a school, if you're working in a really good supportive trust, you can have your subject network meetings and you can do all of those things. And that in itself is a form of thought leadership, but it's also a form of supportive community at each step in your career.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface here today. I feel like I want you back, Rebecca, to have like a whole in-depth discussion about everything, because there's so much interesting stuff coming out.
It's really interesting. Yeah. I just want just a quick question. You know, you're talking about community, Rebecca. Do you think that was eroded to an extent when league tables came in? Because that was my feeling, that suddenly schools were competing against each other rather than forming partnerships for education.
I think potentially, Marie, you're right with that, because schools were having to compete for student numbers in certain areas and what have you. And I think the shift towards trust has improved that a great deal, because you've suddenly got the working partnerships with inside your trust. But I think another positive to come out of COVID was externally sharing beyond your trust as well. And I think online has kind of promoted that as well, because people are happy to be a thought leader online. The amount of people you see on Twitter sharing top tips and advice. And I don't think we've seen that pre-COVID, potentially. Like you say, people were possibly in an individual school where you're competing for grades, you're competing for your league tables, you're competing for students, but you've suddenly got the collaboration and the trust that's kind of started to break that ice and kind of introduce that collaboration a little bit further. And then COVID, I think everybody did work together to reduce workload and kind of get the whole country through a very, very difficult period, really. And I don't think that's gone since. I mean, obviously, you know that I work with the leaders team as well, so we've done quite a lot of live chats and what have you. There are so many lovely people really willing to come on and share their good practice, and I think that's a phenomenal sort of situation to be in.
Amazing.
If you do want to have a look at what that additional CPT that Twinkl offer, we do have our teach meets. Feel free to have a look on the Twinkl website. This has been so fascinating. I wish we could just stay forever. But unfortunately
maybe we'll have you back again, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you, Jodie and Marie, so much for having me here today. It's been an absolutely fantastic, fascinating conversation.
If you want to know more about AI in the classroom, you can have a look back at our Series 2 episode with guest Dan Fitzpatrick from Third Box.
Yes.
It's a really, really fascinating episode, that. And if you want to be part of the conversation, email us at beyondmailbag@twinkl.co.uk. And Marie, how do you spell Twinkl?
Remember that Twinkl has no E.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, and all that other stuff. Thank you again. It's been absolutely fantastic, Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us.
Lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
This podcast is proudly produced by Beyond. Please bear in mind the views and opinions expressed are those of individuals and may not represent those of Beyond or Twinkl.